Welcome to the final part of the DHC-5 mini-series. If you haven't listened to the first two parts yet, I recommend you do so to understand what is going on in the report. Now, get cozy, turn off the lights and listen to my voice while you slowly drift off to sleep. 1.17 Additional information. 1.17.1 Farnborough Flying Display Organization and Regulations. The Farnborough International 1984 exhibition was organized by the Society of British Aerospace Companies. The SBAC Flight Operations Committee controlled the content of the flying display, whilst day-to-day control was exercised by the Flying Control Committee, under the chairmanship of the Officer Commanding Experimental Flying Department, Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. Prior to the exhibition, all exhibitors had received comprehensive information concerning the conditions of participation and the flying orders for display aircraft. Amongst these conditions were the following. 1. Exhibitors presenting aircraft in the flying display must supply a full written description of the flight maneuvers and linking maneuvers to be used in the proposed display in both good and bad weather conditions. 2. Each exhibitor presenting aircraft in the flying display must certify that the flying display he proposes is within the safe capabilities of the pilot or pilots and the aircraft. 3. Prior to the opening of the exhibition, a demonstration must be given before the Flying Control Committee of the intended flight display previously described in writing. All these requirements were satisfied concerning the participation of C-GCTC in the flying display. Orders concerning flying limitations during the display included the following. 1. Aircraft may not be flown over the spectators' enclosures. 2. Aircraft may not be flown closer to the spectators than the center line of the main runway for level flypasts, and the display line for all other maneuvers. 3. No maneuver is to be attempted which is likely to jeopardize the safety of spectators in the event of mishap or misjudgment. 4. During the flying display, pilots of aircraft which are balked or which overshoot on a landing approach will not be permitted to make a second attempt at landing at Farnborough. The alternative airfield or airfields will be specified at the daily briefings. 5. Breaches of flying discipline are liable, in the first instance, to result in the pilot being required to break off his display and land. Repeated or serious breaches will result in the pilot's suspension from flying for the remainder of the exhibition. 1.17.2 CAA Guidance on Safety Arrangements at Air Displays. Civil Aviation Publication CAP 403 contains a guidance to organizers of flying displays, races and rallies in order to assist them in meeting their direct responsibilities for the safety both of spectators at an event and of persons and property in its vicinity. Pertinent advice is included concerning the selections of sites for public enclosures and is summarized as follows. Participating aircraft normally perform relative to a line, the display axis, which is parallel to a runway. The distance between the display axis and the crowd line should be related to the speed of the aircraft. It should be such as to ensure that the aircraft will not, at any point in the display, fly nearer to the crowd line than 110 meters for indicated airspeeds up to 200 knots and 155 meters for speeds above that figure. Wherever possible, spectators should be confined to one side of the site. Effective barriers and marshalling arrangements are required to keep spectators clear of aircraft maneuvering areas. Areas in which spectators are not permitted should be properly enclosed at all times. Marshallers should be detailed to control the movement of spectators throughout. 1.17.3 Spectators' enclosures. Farnborough. Prior to the commencement of the flying display, a safety barrier is positioned parallel to and south of the main runway 25. All spectators are marshaled south of this barrier, which is 93 meters, 305 feet from the runway centerline. The display line, which is marked by additional aerodrome lighting, is positioned parallel to and north of the runway at a distance of 210 meters, 690 feet from the crowd line. Crowd marshalling and control was carried out by the MOD police. On 4th of September 1984, the total attendance was 33,901 spectators, with 299 MOD police officers on duty within the aerodrome. 1.17.4 Preferred runway. Runway 25/07 is the longest runway at Farnborough Aerodrome, and takeoffs and landings in the 25 direction are preferred in order to minimize the disturbance over built-up areas. A further consideration is that consistency of display direction and positioning can be better achieved if one runway only can be used, and positioning from the spectator's viewpoint is much better using runway 25. The selection of the runway to be used is made by the Senior Air Traffic Control Officer on the basis of the weather forecast and with the agreement of the Chairman of the Flying Control Committee. 1.17.5 Maximum Tailwind Component. The planned maximum tailwind component acceptable during the display was 10 knots. The Chairman and Committee would order a runway change if the actual wind was measured at a downwind component in excess of 10 knots by a significant amount, say 5 knots, for a significant length of time, say 15 minutes. A further factor when considering a runway change was the extent to which different types of aircraft could safely cope with a tailwind component. The DALE recorded surface wind data showed that the maximum recorded tailwind during the display time on the day of the accident was 9.85 knots, and that the maximum recorded tailwind component for the hour during which the accident flight took place was 5.87 knots. 1.18 New investigation techniques. None. 2. Analysis. 2.1 General. It is apparent from the mass of photographic and eyewitness evidence that, whilst positioning for an approach and STOL landing, the aircraft entered a steep descending turn from which the commander was either unable or failed to recover fully before the aircraft struck the ground violently. Although the weather conditions at the time, specifically the surface and low-level winds, were such as to make accurate display flying difficult, they could not be described as unduly hazardous. In this context, several pilots who had completed their flying displays before the accident flight reported experiencing some moderate low-level turbulence and cross and tailwind components on the final approach, sufficient to cause them to abandon their touchdown aiming point, the runway threshold, and accept the landing further down the runway. Given the conditions prevailing, these were demonstrably prudent decisions. Accepting the fact that there was no suitable runway facing into wind, the choice of runway 25 for the display flying, while certainly not ideal, cannot be described as unreasonable. Either runway 25 or 07 would have had a significant crosswind component, and the tailwind component on runway 25 never exceeded the 10-knot limitation postulated by the Flying Control Committee. In view of the takeoff and landing distances available, the types of aircraft involved, and the weights at which these are habitually demonstrated, this limit must be considered a reasonable one. In fact, during the hour in which the accident flight occurred, the maximum recorded tailwind component was less than 6 knots. 2.2 The Commander's Evidence. In his initial statement, made 2 days after the accident, the commander reported that whilst on the final approach, at an indicated airspeed of 85 knots, the aircraft entered a steep and rapid descent which he was unable to prevent. The stall warning system did not operate, and although engine power was increased in order to check the rate of descent, it was obvious to him that the situation was irretrievable. He therefore did all that he could do to minimize the impact. In a subsequent statement, taken some months after the incident, the commander first mentioned the technique used by some Buffalo pilots of deliberately selecting reverse thrust from the propellers in flight in order to reduce the airspeed more quickly towards the ideal before starting the final approach. He tacitly agreed that this technique was used on the accident flight, but attributed the subsequent partial loss of control to the failure of the right-hand propeller to return to the positive range when the power levers were reselected forward of the approach idle stop. He went on to describe how this condition caused the aircraft to start to enter an incipient spin to the right, how power was increased but seemed to worsen the situation, and how it was not until the aircraft was close to the ground that the right-hand propeller returned to the positive range and he was able to apply forward power, raise the nose, and reduce the severity of the impact. If a situation akin to that described by the commander did, in fact, occur, and the right-hand propeller remained in reverse for a significant time during the approach, it is entirely possible that this could have induced the control problems that were described. However, no material evidence could be found to support the commander's belief that recovery from this condition was impossible until just before the aircraft struck the ground. 2.3. Evidence from other sources. The videotape analysis confirmed that, on the final approach, the aircraft yawed and rolled into a steep side-slipping descent to the right. In addition, there was some indication from the difference in smoke emission from the engine exhausts that there may have been a short transitory period after I-12 when the aircraft was under a degree of asymmetric power. However, both propeller/engine control systems had functioned normally during the pilot's pre-flight checks and during the immediate pre-impact phase of the flight. In addition, the right-hand system was found to function normally during extensive post-accident testing. The left-hand system could not be tested due to accident damage, but examination revealed no evidence of pre-impact malfunction. Accordingly, the assumption must be that this power asymmetry was either pilot-induced by an inadvertent stagger on the power levers or occurred because the dynamic response of the right-hand propeller was slightly slower than that of the left. It must also be mentioned that the commander's recollection of applying a considerable amount of forward power at an early stage in the approach, in order to recover the situation, is not confirmed by the evidence. The BBC videotape soundtrack showed that engine noise was clearly audible at takeoff and shortly before landing. It is considered that, had there been any significant power increase on the final approach, even for a brief period, this also would have been recorded on the soundtrack. No such increase was evident, nor were there any eyewitness reports of a power increase, until shortly before impact. Further confirmatory evidence of the absence of any early increase in power is provided by consideration of the gas generator and propeller spool-up times compared with the propeller blade angles at impact. Evidence provided by the manufacturer shows that when the power levers are moved forward from flight idle to full power, the gas generator takes 1.9 seconds to generate sufficient power to rotate the propeller at 100% NP. Analysis of the BBC video soundtrack has shown the first audible burst of power commencing 1.8 seconds before impact. It would therefore appear most likely that, prior to the final sudden application of power, the power levers were considerably retarded, in fact at or below the flight idle gate. Had they been at any higher setting, then the propellers would have been found in a constant speed range, around plus 25 degrees at impact, whereas in fact they had only reached plus 17 degrees and plus 12 degrees, respectively. Further credence to this supposition is the calculated descent rate over the last 5 seconds of the flight of 2,700 feet per minute, only reducing to 1,800 feet per minute at the very last moment, and the average descent angle of 21 degrees compared with that of the previous day's demonstration of 10 degrees, and with the normal STOL approach angle of 7.5 degrees using approach power. 2.4. Unorthodox use of the flight controls. There is little doubt that demonstration pilots, when displaying aircraft in front of potential customers, do on occasion fly their aircraft outside the published limits, and that their experience and ability should tell them precisely how far beyond the published limits they can go with safety. In displaying the Buffalo, the commander has conceded that he used an approach technique that, whilst not forbidden, was not the one recommended in the aircraft's operating manual and which was not within the tested flight envelope. It must be assumed that he had used this technique on previous demonstration flights and that it was, to him, an acceptable method of getting the Buffalo to fly a steep approach followed by a short landing, which would have been impossible for most other aircraft. Equally, it must be said that his company had observed and approved his display before the aircraft left Canada. Thus, it would be surprising if they were entirely unaware that, on occasion, the aircraft was being flown beyond the limits recommended in their own manual. It is patently impossible to establish whether the commander had ever used the flight controls in the particular combination used on this flight during any previous demonstrations. However, there must be a strong presumption that, at the completion of the final left-hand turn and because of the strong crosswind, for which he admitted he had not made sufficient allowance, the commander found his aircraft positioned too close to the runway in relation to its height for a normal STOL approach, that accordingly he moved the power levers so as to operate deeper into the ground operation and reverse sector of the better range than his normal practice in demonstrations, in order to appreciably steepen his approach path, and that this produced unforeseen conditions such as blanking of the tailplane and elevators and asymmetric track, which he had not previously experienced. Support for this theory is provided by the video evidence of the initial tailplane oscillation, the shudder reported by the co-pilot, and the commander's report that he felt that he was unable to prevent the aircraft from descending very steeply and rapidly. Although this situation could have been symptomatic of a normally stalled condition, both pilots were adamant that the stall warning did not operate and that their airspeed at the time was 85 to 90 knots, in contrast to the normal power-off stalling speed in the configuration of 57 knots in level flight or 68 knots with 45 degrees of bank. The commander's assertion that his problem in controlling the aircraft commenced when he reselected positive thrust has already been discussed. However, it must be said that the investigation has disclosed no reason why control could not have been regained at this stage had the power levers been moved forward symmetrically and kept forward, as indeed occurred shortly before impact. 2.5. Flying display pressures. A further effect of the crosswind would have been a tendency to carry the aircraft across the runway centerline and towards the spectators. In this situation, the pressure to keep the aircraft away from spectators, and thus save the possible embarrassment of censure by the Flying Control Committee, cannot be overlooked. Had an overshoot, or go-around, been initiated successfully as discussed in the previous paragraph, such a maneuver would have caused the aircraft to fly over the spectators and also, according to the display regulations, would have precluded the aircraft from making a second approach, since a diversion was mandatory after a missed approach. Finally, it must be stated that the Buffalo, with its remarkable STOL performance, is capable of salvaging an approach which may be well outside the capabilities of most other aircraft, and the commander may have had confidence in his ability to be able to land from this difficult situation in a manner that would demonstrate the capabilities of the aircraft and his own competence. In contrast, it is estimated that had the aircraft made a normal STOL approach from the position and height at which the final left-hand turn was completed, using an average angle of descent of 7.5 degrees to 10 degrees, it would have touched down at or beyond the far end of the runway. At any flying display, demonstration pilots are under a degree of pressure to provide a polished and precise exhibition regardless of the conditions. At an international display, when manufacturers are presenting their products for worldwide approval, a spectacular flying demonstration can well attract the attention of potential customers, and the pressures on the pilots concerned become considerably greater. The commander was a well-known personality at the Farnborough Air Show, having displayed aircraft there on previous occasions, and his demonstration of the Buffalo, with its remarkable STOL performance, was one of the highlights to be anticipated in a display. This may well have been a further factor in the commander's determination to persevere in his attempt to make a short landing. 2.6. Other considerations. 2.6.1. The safety of spectators. Following the impact, a considerable amount of debris landed in an area that was used by spectators. Furthermore, the degree of damage that was caused to the aircraft in the static display park and to motor vehicles in the spectator's car park show that the debris was potentially lethal. Indeed, the geographic relationship between the accident site and the damaged aircraft shows that debris must have flown close to, or even between, spectators in that area. In view of the above factors, particularly the severity of damage and the relative close proximity of the accident site to an area reserved for spectators, the regulations and advice concerning safety arrangements at flying displays were examined in detail. In fact, the only requirement concerning the organization of flying displays is that the CAA should be informed of the event and their approval obtained. The CAP 403, which contains the authority's advice concerning safety arrangements at flying displays, is apparently directed at the organizers of relatively small events and does not encompass the greater problems of ensuring spectator safety at major international events. However, it is to be expected that at such major events, the organizers will take their responsibilities extremely seriously concerning the safety of the large numbers who will normally attend. It must be accepted that, to guard against every possible hazard from aircraft at these displays, the spectators would have to be distanced so far from the events as to render the display valueless. In the subject accident, a large piece of debris was projected over 800 meters from the accident site. Furthermore, it is considered that spectators who attend the flying display do so in the knowledge that they accept a slightly increased level of risk as compared with more mundane events, albeit assuming that all reasonable steps are taken to minimize this risk. Farnborough Aerodrome is situated close to densely populated urban areas, and for this reason, it could be argued that it is not a perfect site for a major international display. Nevertheless, it is concluded that the measures taken by the organizers, outlined in Part 1 of the report, provided an acceptable compromise between the ideal and the practicable in terms of safety. 2.6.2 Provision of recording equipment at major air displays. The inquiry was considerably handicapped by the absence of calibrated recording equipment either within or outside the aircraft. In particular, the availability of a flight data recorder on the accident aircraft would, in this instance, have been of particular assistance. However, it is unrealistic to require the installation, for air displays alone, of a flight recorder to an aircraft such as the Buffalo, which was not required to have one fitted in its normal role. Again, although the availability of fully calibrated cine or video cameras would have been of considerable assistance had they photographed the accident sequence, the number required to give full coverage of possible accident scenarios makes any firm recommendation on these lines impracticable. 2.6.3 The carriage of passengers on display flights. The damage caused by flying debris in the area of the flight deck and first row of passenger seats illustrates the possible hazards to all on board such flights should an accident occur. Since the risk factor during display flying, as distinct from customer demonstration flights, is potentially greater than on normal passenger-carrying flights, it would seem desirable that the numbers on board such display flights should be kept to a minimum. A safety recommendation is made accordingly. 3. Conclusions. A. Findings. Roman 1. The commander and co-pilot were properly licensed and qualified to carry out the display flight. Roman 2. The aircraft was correctly loaded and its documentation was in order. Roman 3. The aircraft had been properly maintained in accordance with the manufacturer's maintenance schedule. Roman 4. The aircraft's display sequence had been approved by its manufacturer and by the Farnborough Air Display Flying Control Committee. Roman 5. No evidence could be found of any serious in-flight malfunction of the aircraft's flight or engine and propeller control systems. However, it is probable that the use of the aircraft's flight controls outside the tested flight regime and differing response characteristics of the two propeller control systems caused the commander a temporary handling problem. Roman 6. Taken on its own, This handling problem should not have been so serious as to cause an accident at the hands of an experienced display pilot such as the commander, had he elected to initiate an overshoot, go-around, at a sufficiently early stage. Roman 7. The combination of adverse cross and downwind components, the pressure to complete the display sequence and, probably, a transitory handling problem were sufficient to cause the commander to misjudge the aircraft's final approach to the extent that his aircraft contacted the runway at an excessive rate of descent. Roman 8. Although it is impracticable to guard against every possible hazard resulting from an aircraft accident at a flighting display, the organizers had taken all reasonable precautions to minimize the associated risk. B. Cause. The accident resulted from an error of judgment by the aircraft commander. Unfavorable weather conditions, a transitory handling problem whilst flying outside a tested flight regime, and the pressure on the commander to complete his flying sequence were probably contributing factors. 4. Safety recommendations. 4.1. It is recommended that organizers of air displays ensure that only the minimum safe number of operating crew be carried on board those aircraft taking part in the display, which are to undertake other than routine maneuvers such as would be judged acceptable in normal passenger carrying operations. Signed by C.C. Allen, Inspector of Accidents, Accidents Investigation Branch, Department of Transport, October 1985.